OK, new laws to fight hate crime in Scotland come into force next week. It extends protection for vulnerable groups with a new criminal offence of stirring up hatred. Opponents say it's an attack on free speech and that police could be deluged with complaints about statements that people find offensive. The First Minister, though, says the legislation makes it clear what passes for a crime under the new legislation. Let's get the thoughts now of Susan Smith from For Women Scotland. That's a women and children's rights group. And we're also joined by Susan Douglas-Scott from the diversity campaign group Celebrate Scotland. Welcome both of you to the programme. You're both called Susan, so I'll try my best not to get you mixed up. But first of all, Susan Douglas-Scott, let me ask you what you make of these new laws.
Well, I'm a disabled woman. I'm also a lesbian. And these laws this particular hate crime legislation was specifically designed for minorities. Women are not in the minority, and misogyny is such an underpinning hatred and abuse of women in Scotland, so it needs to be separate in my belief. So this particular hate crime act will look at how am I supported as a disabled woman? How are lesbian and gay and bisexual transgender people supported to be able to live their lives, to be valued in this society, and not to be subject to the terrible abuses that people currently are. We know that young disabled people are much more likely to be subjected to hate crime and abuse, as we also know, particularly within LGBT people.
And Susan, speaking as an LGBT person and a disabled person, do you feel that this new legislation will give you more protection?
Yes, I think it will, because the current equalities legislation doesn't go far enough. But this particular piece of legislation will allow the courts to determine what constitutes abuse of minority people in terms of hate crime. And I think that's the important point to hold on to here. This is not about controlling how people think or how they feel. It's about the actions of people. And when I do equalities training with people, I do an exercise and I ask people to triangulate those three things. I say, what is it you feel when you see this particular situation that's different to you? What do you think? And then what are your actions? And it's what we train ourselves to contain, because we're all judgmental. We're all, we are our own individual person. So therefore, we don't always understand or like or trust other people who are. And in a civilised society, what we want is to be kind to everybody.
And Susan Smith, what do you think we'll see then when this legislation comes into force on Monday?
Well, I think there's a general principle. There's a problem with hate crime as having aggravated factors per se, because it sets up hierarchies within society of who is supported and valued and who is not. And obviously the big lacuna in here is women. Putting sex in at the start would have ensured consistency, and it would have prevented duplication. And I realise people argue that misogyny needs to be covered separately. The fact of the matter is that the Scottish Government is not doing that. They are not making strides to do that. And having a separate misogyny law may well end up eroding the principle that all are equal under law, and it may be open to challenges. So when we have these extended stirring up offences, one of the things we always say is that the process can be the punishment for people. It's all very well saying that the courts will determine, but in the run-up to courts making these judgments, people will see their lives upended. They can see equipment taken away, their phones. We've been contacted by women who are carers, by people who need this stuff for work, saying that they do not know what is going to happen if the police decide to investigate. And the fact of the matter is the police have said they will investigate all complaints. And we know some people are gearing up to make spurious and malicious complaints, and that some people are inevitably going to be caught in this. So on the one hand, we have groups of people who are openly running around saying they're going to report, for example, J.K. Rowling to the police for calling a male person a man. And on the other hand, we have no protection for women's belief, that some women's belief, mine included, that sex is mutable. So there's an inequality that is built into this. We know the police have said that the training is inadequate. The chair of the Police Federation has said that it's not fit for purpose. they are saying things like, before you know it, you've committed a hate crime, which is a nonsense in the context that these crimes need intent behind them. There are huge problems with the training in this.
Susan Douglas-Scott, do you think that is a concern about spurious complaints? Because one of the examples that has been put out there is that you'll have people trawling around shows at the Edinburgh Fringe this year looking to be offended by something, so they can make a complaint.
You could suppose about a lot of things. We don't actually know how people are going to react. What we do know is there's a lot of hurt out there and a lot of damage has been done over the years. We see that from the thousands and thousands and thousands of reports that organisations like the Equality Network, disability organisations, I've been involved in disability rights since the 80s, and we see huge spikes in the abuse that disabled people experience. This is not right, but in my experience of working, particularly with disabled people, I don't think that people are going to be making stuff up and finding ways, because it's time consuming for the complainant as well, and your life is put through the mill. So this is about, let's get sensible here. Let's offer protection. Let's offer support, and in a civilised society, let's be kind and loving to everybody in society, and have our own views. Whatever our own views are, kept private so that they're not hurting other people.
Do you think, Susan Smith, there's a better way of dealing with this issue? If you think that there's going to be problems with this legislation once it comes into force?
Yeah, I actually think that this may all collapse under the weight of malicious complaints. It's all very well saying be kind to people, be nice to people, keep your opinions private. That's not what we do in a democratic society. That is not how we are supposed to function politically. We can't all not talk about issues which face society. And the fact of the matter is that hate crime is declining. It's came off spikes in 2011, 2012. So it's actually not spiking at the moment. I'm not on top of what is happening, particularly with disability, but it would seem to me that if Scotland is this benighted country that's awash with people committing actual crime as opposed to saying hurtful things, then we have a societal problem, and that reflects very badly on the government that's been in power for over 15 years, that apparently has presided over seeing Scotland turn into this terrible place. But I would say one of the issues here is that we know police already do take hate crime more seriously than other crime, and we have faced a group. We as a women's organisation, we get a lot of threats. Women have actually faced violence, including being spat at, being punched in the face. These crimes are not taken as seriously as some of the things people have tweeted or some of the stickers that people have put up, simply because they are not crimes that attract an aggravator. I think if the Scottish government really wants to deal with some of the worst problems in Scotland, they need to start tackling violence against women, they need to start tackling pornography and prostitution, and they need to start looking at things which genuinely do blight all women's lives, regardless of other intersections, which are obviously incredibly important, and factor into misogyny, which is the real overriding issue here.
And Susan Douglas-Scott, we've heard a concern there that people might feel, they might kind of start self-censoring what they say, and that, the sort of restriction on freedom of speech will come into it in that way. Isn't that a concern?
This is not about constraining freedom of speech, and we can have reasoned arguments and share our differences of an opinion in a way that does not offend other people, and I think that's what we need to get to. That's what the Scottish Government, I think, want to get to. But I would disagree that there's not been a lot of work done around misogyny, because Dame Helena Kennedy QC has led on an extensive consultation on misogyny and criminal justice, and has recommended that a new act be introduced that specifically looks at the patriarchal ecosystem that we do live in. I'm a feminist. I know misogyny is alive and well, but I think that it needs to be tackled specifically. And this, her suggestions are that specifically captures legislation and draws it all together to make sure that we look at, what are the issues where people stir up hatred against women and girls? What is, public misogynistic harassment that your other colleague there is talking about women and girls being spat at? I have experienced those things as a woman. I've experienced them as a disabled person. I've experienced them as a lesbian. And so for me, to have a range of legislation that the Scottish Government is proposing and supporting will help us move towards a society that enables freedom of speech, enables us to talk as calmly and as clearly and as effectively as possible without actually causing harm. And I think that's where we want to get to. And
Susan Smith, just to pick up on a point there, I mean, it seems to me that that most people in Scotland are law-abiding citizens, and people know surely most people know what is an offensive and not an offensive thing to say in terms of what might get reported to police.
I don't think they do, because one of the things that we've seen, and we've seen it from respected commentators, we've seen it from MSPs, they will say that, for example, what they call misgendering, which is something that obviously J.K. Rowling was reported to the police for, many people see that as transphobic. Many people think that is a hate crime. Patrick Harvey, during the progress of this bill through Parliament, made similar accusations against colleagues, including Joanne Lamont and Joe McAlpine. So when you are talking about what reasonable people believe, I would hope that a minister in the Scottish Government is a reasonable person, and yet it's clear that for someone like him, talking about these issues, talking about what is a man and a woman, is an offensive thing to do. So I don't think there's a universal acceptance of what is the baseline for causing offence. I think it's a very, very personal experience. And one thing we do have or do not have in these stirring up offences, religion, for example, has a carve out for antipathy, ridicule and dislike, and this isn't in the other characteristics. So it is possible that if you were making a joke, making fun of somebody, that would be captured because it's explicitly excluded from the carve-outs. And that was something that Humza Yousaf tried to bring in with amendments at a late stage of the progress of this bill, and they were quashed because there was such an outcry about them, and people were worried they wouldn't be able to report people for making fun of their beliefs.
Okay, well, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us this morning and giving us your thoughts on Scotland's new hate crime legislation. That is Susan Douglas-Scott and Susan Smith.